The sun beat down on the village square, turning the dust into a golden haze. Simon stood at the very center of the marketplace, his shadow stretching long across the packed earth. He waited until the chatter of the merchants died down, then raised his arms high. "I will build the finest workshop this region has ever seen," he shouted. His voice echoed against the stone walls of the surrounding houses. He pointed toward the empty, weed-choked plot of land behind him, tracing the outline of a structure that existed only in his mind. The villagers stopped their work. They turned, faces bright with interest, and began to clap. A few men stepped forward, offering firm pats on his back and loud words of encouragement. Simon stood taller, his chest swelling with the weight of their attention. He looked out at the sea of nodding heads, soaking in the sound of his own name mixed with their praise. It felt as if the roof were already overhead and the walls were already solid. He gestured again, more grandly this time, promising a legacy that would outlast them all. The crowd cheered louder, their approval washing over him like a warm tide. He closed his eyes for a second, savoring the feeling of being a man who had already achieved greatness, oblivious to the empty dirt beneath his feet. The morning sun hit the workshop plot with a harsh, unforgiving light. Simon stepped out of his house, his mind still echoing with the phantom sound of yesterday's cheers. He walked to the corner of the lot where he had stacked his saws and hammers. He reached down to pick up the heavy iron mallet. It did not feel like a tool of creation. It felt like lead. He gripped the handle, but his muscles refused to tense. The weight of the metal pulled his arm down, dragging his shoulder toward the dirt. He dropped it. The sound of the mallet hitting the ground was dull, flat, and final. He looked at the empty plot. The weeds he had ignored yesterday now seemed to mock him, tangled and thick. He knelt, pressing his palms into the dry, packed earth. There was no vision here. No blueprints. No progress. Only the hollow memory of the applause that had felt so real just hours ago. He stood up, wiped the dust from his hands, and stared at the tools scattered in the dirt. The fire he had felt in the marketplace was gone. Weeks bled into months, and the pattern hardened into a cage. Every time the doubt grew too loud, Simon returned to the marketplace. He stood on the same crate, raised his voice, and promised a new, grander workshop. The villagers clapped. He felt the familiar, fleeting rush of validation. But as soon as he stepped back into the privacy of his shed, the energy vanished. The pottery wheel sat untouched, a thick layer of gray dust coating the wood. The house plans he had drawn with such fervor curled at the edges, forgotten on a workbench. He tried to start, but his hands felt heavy, as if the air in the room were pressing against him. He watched the seasons change through the cracks in the walls, his spirit dampening with every passing day. The promises he made to others became weights around his own neck. One evening, the weight finally pulled him down. He walked to the ancient village well, the stone cool and slick under his touch. He sat on the edge, his head buried in his hands, his breath ragged. The silence of the night was no longer a comfort. It was a mirror reflecting his failure. He did not hear the footsteps approach until a shadow fell across his boots. The elder sat down beside him. The elder did not speak for a long time. He simply sat, his hands resting on his knees, watching the moon reflect in the dark water of the well. Simon felt the silence pressing into him, forcing the truth to the surface. He confessed everything. He spoke of the marketplace, the cheering, and the hollow emptiness that followed every single promise. He admitted that the workshop was a ghost, a structure built of words that vanished the moment he stood alone. The elder listened, his face unreadable, his breathing slow and rhythmic. When Simon finally stopped, his shoulders slumped. The elder turned. "Your heart is heavy because you are trying to build with air," he said. The voice was thin, dry, and steady. He stood up, his joints creaking, and motioned for Simon to follow. They walked through the sleeping village, the dirt path cool under their feet. They reached a small, walled garden tucked behind the elder's home. The air here smelled of damp earth and crushed mint. The elder stopped at a wooden table, his movements deliberate. He reached into a small leather pouch and pulled out 2 seeds. He held them out, one in each palm, the surfaces rough and dark. He looked at Simon, his gaze sharp. "Watch," he whispered, and the anticipation in the small space grew thick. The elder knelt by a patch of rich, dark soil. He dug a small hole with his bare fingers, placed the first seed inside, and covered it with earth. He patted the dirt down until it was flat and unremarkable. He did not mark the spot. He did not speak. Then, he stood and walked to a jagged, sun-bleached rock near the garden gate. He held the second seed high, his voice suddenly booming across the garden wall. "Look," he shouted to the children passing by. "I have a seed that will grow into a magnificent tree." The children gathered, clapping and cheering. The elder placed the seed on the flat, exposed stone, bowing as if he had performed a miracle. The days turned into weeks. The elder watered the hidden patch of earth in total silence, never mentioning it to a soul. Meanwhile, the seed on the rock baked under the relentless midday sun. Birds landed on the stone, pecking at the shell until it cracked. Wind swept the remains into the dust. The public spectacle vanished, leaving nothing but a barren rock. But deep beneath the surface of the hidden patch, the first seed swelled. A vibrant, pale green sprout finally broke through the soil, reaching upward. The elder stood over the small, green shoot. He did not look at Simon, but his voice cut through the garden air with absolute precision. "A dream is like this seed," he said. "It requires the darkness of silence to take root." He turned, his eyes locking onto Simon's. "When you announce your plans, you spend the energy meant for action on the pleasure of words. You feel finished before you have even begun." The words landed like stones in a pool. Simon looked at the empty rock where the second seed had been, then back at the living sprout. The connection was instantaneous. He saw the marketplace, the cheering crowd, and the hollow feeling that followed. It was not bad luck. It was a theft. He had been stealing his own strength to pay for the applause of strangers. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at his own hands, calloused but empty, and understood the cost of his noise. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and turned toward the gate. Simon walked into his shed and pulled the heavy door shut. He did not lock it, but the click of the latch felt like a final boundary. He looked at the pile of lumber in the corner. He chose a single, rough-hewn plank. He did not announce his intent to the village. He did not imagine the applause of a crowd. He simply picked up the saw. The first cut was jagged, the wood resisting the blade with a dry, splintering sound. He stopped, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and adjusted his grip. He felt the familiar itch to step outside and tell the neighbors what he was building, but he pressed his lips together and turned back to the bench. He picked up the chisel. He placed the edge against the grain and struck it with the mallet. The wood gave way in a clean, curling shaving. He struck again and again. The rhythm of the work began to fill the small space. It was a steady, percussive sound that drowned out the memory of his past failures. When his shoulders burned, he did not stop. When he made a mistake, he did not hide it. He sanded the wood until the surface was flat and true. He was no longer a man of words. He was a man of dust, sweat, and wood. The final pass of the sandpaper left the wood smooth beneath his palm. Simon ran his fingers over the grain, feeling the absence of splinters or rough edges. It was done. He stood up, his back aching, and wiped the fine layer of dust from his hands. He did not call out to the street. He did not seek an audience to witness the completion. He simply picked up the chair and carried it out to the porch, setting it down in the late afternoon sun. The wood caught the light, glowing with a deep, natural warmth. He stepped back, watching the shadows stretch across the porch floor. A neighbor, passing by on the way to the market, stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the chair, then at Simon, his mouth opening in genuine surprise. "When did you build this?" the neighbor asked, stepping closer to touch the perfectly joined legs. "I never heard a word about it." Simon felt the old, familiar itch to explain, to boast, to claim the credit he had once craved, but it passed as quickly as it had come. He smiled, a small, private movement of his lips. "It is finished," he said. The neighbor stood there, stunned, but Simon had already turned back toward the door. The seasons turned, and the shed became a place of constant, quiet motion. Simon stopped counting the days. He stopped measuring his worth by the volume of the village's praise. He simply worked. Tables, shelves, and cabinets emerged from the wood, each piece more precise than the last. He learned to listen to the grain, to respect the resistance of the timber, and to find rhythm in the repetitive strike of the chisel. Years bled into one another, leaving behind a trail of sturdy, functional beauty that filled homes across the region. He was no longer the man who stood in the marketplace shouting at the sun. He was the man whose hands were always stained with sawdust, whose presence was felt in the solid weight of a well-crafted door or the smooth surface of a dining table. When the children of the village grew up, they learned to recognize his work by its balance and strength. They did not need to hear him speak to know his character. He lived by the truth the elder had planted in him long ago. A dream is a seed that must remain buried in the dark soil of effort to survive. He had traded the fleeting pleasure of words for the enduring reality of results. Standing in his workshop, surrounded by the scent of cedar, he picked up his mallet, set his chisel to the next piece of wood, and let the silence speak for him.